Mob boss escaped a high-tech super prison with a mop. The alarm never sounded. At Puente Grande Federal Prison, the morning moved the way it always did. Slow, procedural, numbing in its predictability. Guards checked clipboards. Gates opened and closed on schedule. Laundry carts rolled down corridors, their wheels squealing softly against polished concrete. The prison did what it had been designed to do: absorb movement, swallow noise, and make every day feel exactly like the last. And somewhere in that routine, the most wanted man in Mexico disappeared. It wasn't until hours later, long after the shift change, long after the last cart had passed, that someone noticed a number didn't match. A name on a roster. A cell that should have been occupied but wasn't. A silence where a presence was expected. By then, Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán was already gone. Puente Grande had been sold to the world as a fortress. Cameras. Sensors. Controlled movement. A modern answer to an old problem: how to contain a man who had turned corruption into an art form and violence into a business model. El Chapo wasn't just another inmate. He was a symbol of the drug war's scale, of the money moving beneath it, of the power that survived arrests and headlines. His capture had been celebrated. His incarceration framed as finality. Inside Puente Grande, he was housed in a special wing. Monitored. Restricted. Or so it seemed. The escape didn't begin with chaos. It began with trust. In high-security prisons, nothing moves without permission. But permission isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a nod. A routine. A door left unlocked because it's always been left unlocked. A cart waved through because it belongs. Laundry carts were invisible. They moved daily, unchallenged, their contents uninteresting to guards trained to spot weapons and contraband, not the absence of a man who understood how to disappear in plain sight. That understanding didn't come from desperation. It came from patience. El Chapo had spent months studying Puente Grande. Not the walls, the people. Schedules. Habits. Which guards glanced inside carts and which didn't. Which supervisors trusted their subordinates too much. Which procedures were written down, and which were merely assumed. High-tech prisons rely on one thing more than technology: routine. Routine is what keeps systems efficient. It's also what makes them vulnerable. On the morning of the escape, El Chapo didn't run. He didn't rush. He didn't force anything. He followed a plan so quiet it barely qualified as an action. At the right moment, during a routine shift change when accountability blurred, he stepped into a space designed to be overlooked. A laundry cart. A maintenance load. Cleaning supplies. Fabric. The dull, anonymous tools of prison life. To a guard, it was just another cart. To the system, it was background noise. To El Chapo, it was the exit. Cameras recorded the cart's movement without comment. Doors opened because they were supposed to. Guards waved it through because they always did. No alarms. No questions. No last-second doubts. The prison didn't fail in a dramatic way. It failed politely. When officials finally realized what had happened, panic didn't explode, it seeped. Count checks were rerun. Logs reviewed. Guards questioned. No one had seen anything unusual. No forced doors. No broken locks. No security breach that fit the narrative of an escape. That was the most terrifying part. Puente Grande hadn't been defeated. It had been convinced. Investigators quickly discovered the truth they already suspected but hoped not to confirm. El Chapo hadn't escaped alone. The prison systems hadn't been hacked, they had been bought. Guards admitted to accepting bribes. Schedules had been adjusted. Inspections skipped. Procedures softened just enough to make the impossible feel routine. This wasn't an escape powered by strength. It was powered by access. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Officials were fired. Press followed. Press conferences attempted damage control. But the image had already taken hold. Mexico's most secure prison had been undone by a man hiding among mops. International headlines mocked the sophistication of modern incarceration. Analysts dissected the failure. Critics pointed to corruption as the real architecture behind the prison's collapse. El Chapo, meanwhile, vanished into a network that had been waiting for him. For the next decade, he became a ghost with a reputation. Every rumor of his location triggered raids. Every sighting evaporated. His escape from Puente Grande wasn't just a physical victory, it was psychological. If he could walk out of a super prison unnoticed, what else could he do? The answer, as the world would later learn, was plenty. Inside Puente Grande, the damage went deeper than embarrassment. Trust collapsed. Guards began suspecting each other. Procedures multiplied. Movement slowed. Surveillance intensified. But none of it addressed the core problem. The prison had been designed to stop force. It had never been designed to stop influence. As investigators reconstructed the escape, they focused on the moment that mattered most, not when El Chapo entered the cart, but when the cart passed the final checkpoint. That gate was the line between captivity and freedom. And it had opened without hesitation. But because the guard on duty had waved through hundreds of carts before. Because the system rewarded speed over scrutiny. Because nothing had ever gone wrong that way before. Because no one believed it could. Late in the investigation, officials uncovered a detail that reframed everything. The laundry route El Chapo used had been altered weeks earlier. A minor change. Approved internally. Barely documented. It shortened the path to the exit by minutes and reduced the number of checkpoints by one. It wasn't an accident. It was preparation. When they followed that thread, they found more changes. Small ones. Seemingly harmless. A maintenance exception here. A procedural waiver there. Each insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a corridor of opportunity. A corridor no camera flagged. A corridor no alarm guarded. A corridor built entirely on human trust. The final report concluded what everyone already knew but no one wanted to say publicly. Puente Grande didn't lose El Chapo. It let him go. And when they opened the internal audit room, the one that stored records of maintenance approvals and guard rotations, they discovered a missing file. Not destroyed. Removed. A file that detailed who authorized the changes that made the escape possible. A file that named names. And its absence meant one thing. The escape wasn't over. It was still being protected. By nightfall, Puente Grande was no longer a prison. It was a crime scene pretending to be one. Floodlights burned through the dark as federal agents arrived in waves, their vehicles lining the perimeter like a siege had begun from the inside. Guards were pulled from posts and separated. Radios were confiscated. Logs were seized. Every routine that had once made the prison function was now treated as evidence of failure. Inside the command office, officials replayed footage that told them nothing. Laundry carts moved. Doors opened. Gates closed. Everything worked. That was the problem. The first theory collapsed quickly. There had been no forced exit, no distraction riot, no coordinated attack from outside. El Chapo hadn't overpowered anyone. He hadn't needed to. His escape was so clean it felt unreal, like a magic trick performed with bureaucracy instead of smoke. Investigators shifted focus from how he left to why no one stopped him. The answer was everywhere. And nowhere specific. Guards were interrogated one by one. Most insisted they had followed protocol. Many were telling the truth. That's what made the case so dangerous. Corruption hadn't flooded the prison. It had seeped into it, selectively, patiently. One guard admitted to taking money, but claimed he didn't know what it was for. Another said he'd been told to ignore certain carts during certain hours, for efficiency. A supervisor acknowledged approving minor schedule adjustments without double-checking them. No single confession explained the escape. Together, they formed a picture no one wanted to face. This hadn't been a breach. It had been a collaboration. As the investigation widened, a chilling pattern emerged. El Chapo's influence hadn't surged in the weeks before the escape. It had settled. Payments were smaller. Requests were fewer. Behavior inside the prison had grown calmer, not more volatile. That calm wasn't compliance. It was confidence. Federal analysts mapped the money trail backward. Offshore accounts. Cash couriers. Relatives of low-level staff suddenly paying off debts. New cars parked miles away from the prison, registered to people who technically didn't exist. Corruption hadn't been loud. It had been domestic. It lived in mortgages, tuition payments, hospital bills. It wasn't framed as betrayal, it was framed as help. And once help becomes normal, resistance feels unnecessary. The search for El Chapo began immediately, but it was already behind schedule. Roadblocks went up across Jalisco. Airports were alerted. Border agencies were notified. But the man they were hunting had planned for this exact moment. He didn't flee wildly. He disappeared methodically. Safe houses activated across the region, places that had sat dormant for months, waiting. Vehicles switched. Phones destroyed. Money moved through channels designed to look boring. El Chapo didn't need speed. He needed invisibility. And he had mastered it. Back inside Puente Grande, panic gave way to fear. Not fear of punishment. Fear of implication. Staff stopped trusting one another. Every routine action felt suspicious. Who had known? Who had been paid? Who had simply looked away? The prison fractured under the weight of its own uncertainty. That fracture spread upward. Mexico's justice system took a public beating. International media framed the escape as a farce. Late-night hosts joked about mops and laundry carts. Analysts compared Puente Grande to a stage prop, impressive from a distance, hollow up close. Behind the scenes, the tone was darker. Officials understood what this meant beyond embarrassment. If El Chapo could leave like this once, he could do it again. And if he could do it, others would try. Within days, a sealed internal memo circulated among senior officials. It contained a list of prisons now considered compromised by association. Facilities where staff morale was low. Where pay lagged behind responsibility. Where routine had replaced vigilance. Puente Grande was no longer an anomaly. It was a warning. As the manhunt intensified, something unexpected happened. Information stopped coming in. Not dried up, stopped. Informants went silent. Tips vanished. Regions that had once buzzed with rumors suddenly went dead. It was as if an invisible hand had pressed pause on the underworld. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It happens by instruction. El Chapo wasn't just hiding. He was reorganizing. His escape had proven something powerful. The system could be manipulated without confrontation. Violence wasn't necessary. Chaos was inefficient. Influence, applied patiently, could bend even the most secure institutions. That lesson didn't stay with him alone. It spread. Months passed. The government reshuffled leadership. Anti-corruption units were expanded. New prisons were announced with louder promises and shinier technology. But every reform carried the shadow of Puente Grande. Technology hadn't failed. People had. And people are harder to secure. In the midst of the investigation, a federal prosecutor uncovered a detail that reframed the entire case. A financial transfer, small, legal-looking, had been made to a company contracted for prison maintenance. The company had performed routine work, door sensors, carts, corridor access adjustments. Perfectly normal. Except the company didn't exist before El Chapo arrived. And it dissolved weeks after he left. That discovery cracked open a deeper truth. El Chapo hadn't bribed guards randomly. He had built infrastructure. Legitimate-looking contracts. Paper trails. Administrative cover. His escape wasn't just planned, it was managed. Puente Grande hadn't been infiltrated. It had been integrated. As that realization spread, fear replaced anger at the highest levels of government. This wasn't just about one drug lord humiliating the state. It was about what his escape revealed. Prisons weren't failing because they lacked walls. They were failing because walls don't stop relationships. The case officially went cold after a year, though no one used that phrase publicly. Resources were redirected. Leads evaporated. Attention shifted to other crises. But inside intelligence circles, the escape was studied obsessively. Not as a fluke. As a blueprint. Years later, when El Chapo was finally captured again, officials would say they had learned from Puente Grande. They would build stronger prisons. Tighter controls. More layers. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. Puente Grande had shown the world that the most dangerous prison escapes don't require tunnels, helicopters, or gunfire. They require patience. They require trust. and they require a system that believes danger always looks dangerous. El Chapo had proven otherwise. And as the investigation into his escape faded into history, one question lingered, unanswered and uncomfortably relevant. If a man could walk out of a super prison hidden among mops, how many other exits were already waiting? For more than a decade after the escape, Puente Grande lived on as a cautionary tale told in hushed voices. It wasn't the prison that haunted officials, it was the method. El Chapo hadn't outrun the state. He had outthought it. And that distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. When he resurfaced years later, older, heavier, and just as careful, the world framed his recapture as redemption. Cameras followed armored convoys. Politicians promised lessons learned. The narrative was simple: the fugitive was back where he belonged. But inside law enforcement circles, no one celebrated. Because they knew something the public didn't. The escape had never really ended. Every major prison reform that followed carried Puente Grande's fingerprint. New facilities emphasized isolation. New protocols demanded redundancy. New technologies promised to replace human judgment with automation. Yet every time a system grew more complex, it created new dependencies. And dependencies are leverage waiting to be discovered. The question that lingered wasn't how El Chapo escaped. It was how many others had learned from it. When El Chapo was finally extradited to the United States, officials treated the transfer like a military operation. No public routes. No predictable schedules. No visible patterns. He was placed into a system designed to correct every weakness Puente Grande had exposed. Total isolation. Total monitoring. Total control. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a confession. The American prison that received him wasn't worried about tunnels or laundry carts. They were worried about something far quieter: influence. They restricted communication not because of violence, but because of persuasion. They tracked not just movement, but routine. They randomized procedures to deny predictability. El Chapo had forced an evolution in incarceration philosophy. Not because he was violent, but because he was patient. Back in Mexico, Puente Grande's legacy deepened. The prison eventually closed, its name too radioactive to rehabilitate. New facilities rose in its place, cleaner, stronger, louder about security. But no architect could design out corruption. No wall could block human incentive. The escape had proven something deeply unsettling. Prisons don't fail when doors open. They fail when people agree not to notice. Years later, an internal training document circulated quietly among federal agencies. It used Puente Grande as its primary case study. Not under security breach, but under a more precise heading: systemic persuasion events. The language was clinical, but the message was blunt. The most dangerous criminals don't fight the system. They join it. El Chapo's story became legend, then caution, then curriculum. Analysts dissected every choice he made, not to glorify him, but to understand the anatomy of quiet power. He hadn't escaped because guards were weak. He escaped because systems are human. And humans respond to familiarity, pressure, and reward. The final irony came years after his escape, buried in a financial audit few people read. The maintenance company that helped smooth his exit wasn't the only one of its kind. Similar shell contractors had appeared in other institutions, never tied to escapes, never investigated deeply. Because nothing happened. Which was the point. Puente Grande didn't teach criminals how to escape. It taught them how not to need to. In the end, El Chapo's greatest crime wasn't walking out of a high-tech prison inside a laundry cart. It was proving that the walls never mattered as much as the routines inside them. That the most secure systems in the world can be undone without noise, without force, without urgency. All it takes is time. And a system convinced that danger always announces itself. It doesn't. Sometimes it rolls past you quietly, pushed by a mob. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, hit like, and comment, because the most dangerous escapes don't break walls, they walk through them.